To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Alexander Landry adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows of their suburban home. At 42, he had built what most would consider the perfect life: a successful consulting firm, a beautiful wife, and a son who made him proud every day. The house on Maple Street was modest but comfortable, with white picket fencing and Madeline's prized rose garden blooming in the front yard. "Dad, can you drive me to school today?" Bradley called from the kitchen, his voice carrying that familiar 12-year-old enthusiasm that always made Alexander smile. "Of course, buddy." Alexander walked into the kitchen where Madeline was packing Bradley's lunch, her auburn hair catching the light as she worked with practiced efficiency. After 15 years of marriage, she still took his breath away. "Don't forget the parent-teacher conference next week," Madeline said, sealing the lunch bag. "Mrs. Peterson wants to discuss Bradley's progress in advanced mathematics." Alexander ruffled his son's sandy brown hair. "That's my boy," following in the old man's footsteps with numbers. What his family didn't know was that Alexander's expertise with numbers had once been used for very different purposes. The consulting firm was legitimate now, helping businesses optimize their operations and financial structures. But the analytical mind that made him successful had been honed in a much darker world, one he'd left behind the day he met Madeline. The drive to Riverside Middle School was filled with Bradley's excited chatter about the upcoming science fair. Alexander listened, storing away every detail the way he always did, filing information with the precision that had once kept him alive in situations most people couldn't imagine. "Kyle Hunter's been acting weird lately," Bradley mentioned as they pulled into the school parking lot. "He keeps pushing kids around, trying to start fights." Alexander's hands tightened imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Kyle Hunter? What's his father's name?" "I don't know. Some tough guy, I think. Kyle's always bragging about how scary his dad is." Bradley shouldered his backpack. "Don't worry, Dad. I stay away from trouble." "That's good, son. But remember, never let anyone push you around. Stand up for yourself and for others who can't." Alexander watched his son disappear into the school building, pride swelling in his chest. Bradley was everything he'd hoped for: kind, intelligent, brave when it mattered. The complete opposite of the children Alexander had once known in the world he'd escaped. That afternoon, Alexander was reviewing quarterly reports in his downtown office when his phone buzzed. Madeline's name appeared on the screen, but when he answered, her voice was shaky. "Alex, something happened at school. Bradley's in the principal's office." 20 minutes later, Alexander strode through the corridors of Riverside Middle School, his polished shoes echoing against the tile floors. Principal Janet Ross met him outside her office, her expression grave. "Mr. Landry, I'm afraid there was an incident during lunch." Bradley broke another student's arm. Alexander felt the familiar stillness settle over him, the calm that had once preceded violence in his former life. "What happened?" According to witnesses, Kyle Hunter was bullying a younger student, demanding his lunch money. When the boy refused, Kyle shoved him to the ground and started kicking him. Bradley intervened. Through the principal's window, Alexander could see his son sitting in a chair, his shirt torn, a bruise forming on his cheek. But Bradley's eyes were clear and defiant. No regret, no fear. Alexander had never been prouder. "Kyle's arm is broken in 2 places," Principal Ross continued. "He claims Bradley attacked him unprovoked, but we have multiple witnesses who contradict that story." "Where's Kyle now?" "At the hospital with his father." "Mr. Landry, I have to tell you, Jerome Hunter is, well, he's not someone you want to cross. He has a reputation in this town. He's demanded that Bradley be expelled and is threatening to press charges." The name hit Alexander like ice water. Jerome Hunter. It couldn't be the same man. That Jerome Hunter should be dead or in prison by now. "I need to see my son," Alexander said quietly. Inside the office, Bradley looked up as his father entered. "Dad, I know I'm in trouble, but Tommy's just a little kid. Kyle was really hurting him." Alexander knelt beside his son's chair, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Bradley. Never doubt that. A man protects those who can't protect themselves." But Kyle's arm. Actions have consequences. Kyle learned that today. Alexander's voice carried an edge that made Principal Ross shift uncomfortably. Are you hurt? Just some bruises. But Dad, Cal said his father is going to make us pay. He said his dad is really dangerous. Alexander stood slowly, his mind already working through possibilities. If this was the Jerome Hunter he knew, then his carefully constructed peaceful life was about to collide with a past he'd hoped was buried forever. Mr. Landry, Principal Ross said, perhaps you could talk to Mr. Hunter when he arrives. Try to smooth things over. Alexander turned to look at her, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her step back. Yes, he said softly. I think Jerome Hunter and I need to have a conversation. As they waited, Alexander's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Well, Alexander fucking Landry. I heard you were dead. Hello, Jerome. It's been a long time. The line was quiet for several seconds. Your boy just cost me a lot of money, Alex. Cal was supposed to fight in the youth league next month. Now his arm's fucked. Youth fighting leagues. Of course Jerome would sink that low, using his own son. Alexander felt the familiar cold anger building, the same emotion that had once made him one of the most feared men in the underground world of organized crime. Your son was bullying a smaller child. Bradley stopped him. Your boy's going to pay for this. And so are you. I don't give a shit what you used to be. This is my town now. The line went dead. Alexander stared at the phone, then looked at his son, who was watching him with curious eyes. Dad? Who was that? An old friend, Alexander said. Don't worry about it, buddy. Everything's going to be fine. But as they drove home that evening, Alexander's mind was already shifting into patterns he'd hoped never to use again. Jerome Hunter had made a mistake. He'd threatened Alexander's family. In the world Alexander came from, that was an unforgivable sin. That night, after Bradley was asleep and Madeline was grading papers for her substitute teaching job, Alexander sat in his study, staring at a locked drawer in his desk. Inside were documents and items from a life he'd abandoned 15 years ago, a life where he'd been known by a very different name. He'd hoped Jerome Hunter was part of a past that could never touch his family. But some ghosts, it seemed, refused to stay buried. Chapter 2, Recognition. The next morning arrived with an ominous phone call. Principal Ross's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. Mr. Landry, I need you to come to the school immediately. Jerome Hunter is here, and he's brought people with him. Alexander was already reaching for his keys. How many people? 2 men. Large men. Mr. Landry, I think you should know. Mr. Hunter has been asking questions about you. He seems to know more about your background than I would have expected. 20 minutes later, Alexander pulled into the school parking lot to find a black Escalade with tinted windows parked directly in front of the main entrance. 2 men in expensive suits lounged against the vehicle, their eyes tracking every movement in the area. Professional muscle, but not quite disciplined enough to be military or government. Street thugs who'd learned to dress better. Inside the school, the atmosphere was tense. Teachers whispered in clusters, and several parents who'd come for morning pickup were being directed to use the side entrance. Alexander found Principal Ross in her office, nervously shuffling papers. He's in the conference room, she said without preamble. He's been waiting for an hour. Mr. Landry, maybe you should consider calling the police. That won't be necessary. Alexander walked down the hallway toward the conference room, each step bringing back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The weight of concealed weapons, the taste of adrenaline, the careful calculation of exits and advantages. His body remembered things his mind had tried to bury. The conference room door was closed. Through the frosted glass, Alexander could see 3 silhouettes. He paused, hand on the doorknob, and for a moment allowed himself to become what he used to be. When he opened the door, Jerome Hunter was seated at the far end of the table, flanked by his 2 enforcers. Jerome had aged badly. His face was scarred and weathered, his hair prematurely gray, and there was a hardness in his eyes that came from too many years of violence. But he was still intimidating, still carried himself like a predator. Alexander Landry, Jerome said, not rising from his chair. Or should I call you by your old name? Alex is fine. Alexander closed the door behind him and took a seat directly across from Jerome, ignoring the 2 thugs who shifted nervously. Nice to see you again, Jerome. Is it? Because I'm not feeling particularly friendly right now. Jerome leaned forward, his scarred hands flat on the table. Your boy hurt my son. Broke his arm in 2 places. That kind of injury, it takes time to heal. Time and money. Your son was bullying a smaller child. Bradley stopped him. So I heard. Sounds like you taught him well. But here's the thing, Alex. I don't give a shit about the why. I only care about the what. And what happened is that your boy cost me money. Alexander studied Jerome's face, reading the micro-expressions he'd once used to stay alive. There was something else here, something beyond simple revenge. Jerome was probing, testing. You mentioned youth fighting leagues on the phone. Kyle's 12 years old, Jerome. And he's damn good at it. Takes after his old man. I had big plans for him. Tournaments coming up. Prize money. Now he's out for months, maybe longer. The casual way Jerome discussed using his own son as a commodity confirmed everything Alexander needed to know. This wasn't about fatherly concern or even about Kyle's injury. This was about dominance, territory, and the kind of casual cruelty that defined men like Jerome Hunter. What do you want? Alexander asked. Jerome smiled, and it was a cold thing. I want your boy to learn consequences. I want him to understand what happens when you interfere with my business. And if I refuse, then maybe your perfect little suburban life gets a lot more complicated. Jerome gestured to his men. These are the Wilson brothers, Troy and Andre. They handle problems for me. Big problems, small problems, family problems. The Wilson brothers straightened slightly, hands moving toward their jackets. But Alexander didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. The same smile he'd once worn in boardrooms where life and death decisions were made with handshakes and nods. Jerome, do you remember what I used to do? Before I disappeared? For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Jerome's eyes. That was a long time ago. You've gone soft, playing house in the suburbs. Have I? Alexander leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. Tell me, what happened to Vincent Corelli? The name hit Jerome like a physical blow. Vincent Corelli had been one of the most feared enforcers on the East Coast, a man who'd built an empire on fear and brutality. He'd also been Alexander's last target before disappearing into civilian life. Corelli died in a car accident, Jerome said, but his voice lacked conviction. Did he? Because I remember it differently. I remember Vincent begging for his life in a warehouse outside Baltimore. I remember him promising me anything, money, territory, his own daughter, if I'd let him live. The room fell silent. The Wilson brothers exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain about their employer's decision to bring them here. What's your point? Jerome asked. My point is that you've made a mistake. You've forgotten what I'm capable of. Alexander's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. You've threatened my son. That's not something I take lightly. Jerome tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. You can't touch me, Alex. Too many people know where I am today. Too many witnesses. Jerome, you came to my son's school with armed thugs to threaten a 12-year-old boy. How do you think that's going to play with the locals when word gets out? Nobody's going to. Mrs. Chun in the main office has been recording this entire conversation on her phone through the glass panel. Alexander nodded toward the door. Seemed like a smart precaution, given the circumstances. Jerome spun around to look at the door, where indeed a small woman with a phone could be seen through the frosted glass. You're bluffing. Alexander stood slowly. Troy, Andre, is it? You boys might want to consider who you're working for. Jerome here has a tendency to get people killed. Ask Vincent Corelli. Oh wait, you can't. The Wilson brothers were looking decidedly uncomfortable now. One of them, Troy, cleared his throat. Maybe we should go, boss. Shut up, Jerome snapped, but his authority was cracking. He looked back at Alexander, recognition and fear warring in his expression. This isn't over. Yes, Alexander said quietly, it is. You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to stay away from my family. Because if you don't, if you even think about coming near Bradley or Madeline, I'll remind you why my old friends used to cross the street when they saw me coming. Jerome stood, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. But behind the bluster, Alexander could see the fear. Jerome remembered now, remembered what Alexander Landry, formerly known as the accountant, was capable of. This isn't over, Jerome repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, it is. Alexander walked to the door and opened it. Oh, and Jerome? If Kyle continues bullying other children, I'll make sure Bradley is there to stop him. Every single time. As Jerome and his men filed out, Alexander heard Jerome whisper to Troy, it's really him. Jesus Christ, it's really him. When they were gone, Principal Ross appeared at Alexander's elbow, her face pale. "Mr. Landry, who exactly are you?" Alexander looked at her, then at his reflection in the conference room window. For just a moment, he'd allowed his old self to surface. The man who'd once made million-dollar decisions with other people's lives, who'd eliminated problems with clinical efficiency. "I'm Bradley Landry's father," he said simply. "And that's all that matters." But as he drove home, Alexander knew the truth was more complicated. Jerome Hunter had seen who he really was, and that recognition changed everything. The careful balance he'd maintained for 15 years was collapsing. That evening, he sat in his study again, staring at the locked drawer. This time, he opened it. Chapter 3, The Accountant. Inside the locked drawer lay the artifacts of a life Alexander had tried to forget: a passport under a different name, encrypted USB drives containing financial records that could topple governments, and a single photograph of 5 men in expensive suits standing outside a Chicago courthouse. Alexander picked up the photograph with steady hands. 3 of the men were dead now. He'd killed 2 of them personally, and the third had been eliminated by rivals. The 4th man, Vincent Corelli, had also met his end at Alexander's hands, though the world believed it was a car accident. That left only Jerome Hunter, who'd been the youngest and least important member of their circle. The man Alexander used to be had no name that appeared in any official records. In the criminal underworld, he'd been known simply as the accountant, not because he managed books, but because he balanced equations. When someone owed a debt that couldn't be repaid with money, they paid with their life. When territories needed to be redistributed, he calculated the most efficient methods. When problems needed to disappear, he made the mathematics work. Alexander had been very good at his job. Madeline's voice called from downstairs. "Alex, dinner's ready." He closed the drawer and locked it, then joined his family in the dining room. Bradley was animated, talking about his science project on renewable energy. Madeline listened with the patient attention of a dedicated mother, asking insightful questions that made their son beam with pride. This was why Alexander had left that life behind. Not for fear of consequences or law enforcement. He'd been too careful, too smart to ever be caught. He'd left because he'd met a woman whose smile made him want to be someone worthy of it. "How did the meeting go today?" Madeline asked as she served Bradley another helping of pot roast. "It went well. Jerome Hunter won't be bothering us anymore." "Are you sure?" The man sounded very angry on the phone. Alexander reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "I'm sure. Some people are all bluster. When you stand up to them, they fold." It wasn't entirely a lie. Jerome had folded, at least temporarily. But Alexander knew the man well enough to understand that the humiliation wouldn't sit well. Jerome's pride would demand some kind of response, some way to reassert his dominance. After dinner, while Bradley worked on homework and Madeline graded papers, Alexander made a series of phone calls from his study. The first was to Detective Ray Mitchell of the city police, an old friend who'd helped Alexander establish his legitimate identity years ago. "Alex, it's been months since we talked. How's the family?" "They're good, Ray. But I need a favor. I need everything you have on a man named Jerome Hunter." The line was quiet for several seconds. "Jesus, Alex. That's not a name I expected to hear from you. What's your interest in Hunter?" "He threatened my son today." "Shit. Okay, give me an hour." The second call was to a private investigator in Baltimore, a woman named Kara Stewart, who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. She owed Alexander several significant favors from his previous life. "I need a full workup on Jerome Hunter," Alexander said without preamble. "Current operations, known associates, financial situation, weaknesses. Everything. How deep do you want me to go?" "All the way down." The third call was the most difficult. It was to a secure number he'd hoped never to use again, a number that connected him to resources and capabilities that existed in the shadows between legitimate and criminal enterprises. "Mr. Smith's office." The voice was professionally neutral, giving nothing away. "This is the accountant. I need to speak with Mr. Smith." After a brief hold, a familiar voice came on the line. "Well, I'll be damned. I heard you were dead." Mr. Smith, whose real name Alexander had never known, ran a network of specialists who handled problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. He'd been Alexander's primary contact during his active years. "Just retired. But I might need to come back temporarily." "Family problems?" "Something like that." "What do you need?" Intelligence gathering for now. Maybe more later. I'll send you the details. Alexander ended the call and sat back in his leather chair. In less than an hour, he'd activated resources that most people didn't know existed. By tomorrow, he'd know everything about Jerome Hunter's current life, his business operations, his personal relationships, his vulnerabilities. The next morning brought the first results. Detective Mitchell called while Alexander was driving to work. Jerome Hunter is bad news, Alex. He runs underground fighting circuits, operates illegal gambling, and has connections to some very serious people. But here's the interesting part. He's been having money troubles lately. Word is he overextended himself on some investments and owes significant money to people you don't want to owe money to. How significant? 7 figures. And his creditors aren't the patient type. This was useful information. A man under financial pressure made mistakes, took unnecessary risks. Kara Stewart's report arrived by encrypted email that afternoon. It was thorough and painted a picture of a man whose small-time criminal empire was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Jerome operated 3 underground youth fighting leagues across the state, using kids as young as 10 years old. The prize money was substantial, but most of it went to Jerome's creditors rather than the fighters or their families. Kyle Hunter wasn't just Jerome's son, he was one of his primary income sources. The boy had won 17 consecutive matches and was scheduled for a major tournament that would have netted Jerome over $200,000. Bradley's intervention had cost Jerome significantly more than just pride. But the most interesting information came from Mr. Smith's network. Jerome had been desperate enough to reach out to his old contacts in organized crime, trying to borrow money to cover his debts. Most had refused, but one group, the Kozlov organization, had expressed interest. They were scheduled to meet with Jerome tomorrow night. Alexander knew the Kozlovs by reputation. They were efficient, ruthless, and had no patience for excuses or delays. If Jerome was desperate enough to deal with them, his situation was worse than even Kara's report suggested. That evening, Alexander sat down with Madeline after Bradley had gone to bed. "I need to tell you something," he said carefully, "about my past before I met you." Madeline set down her teacup and studied his face. "This is about Jerome Hunter, isn't it? About why he backed down so quickly. How did you? I've been married to you for 15 years, Alex. I know when you're worried, and I know when you're dangerous. Today at school, you were both." Alexander took her hands in his. "The business I ran before we met, it wasn't entirely legal. I did things I'm not proud of. I hurt people. Did you kill anyone?" The directness of the question surprised him, but he'd always been honest with Madeline about everything else. "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. "Were they bad people? The ones you killed?" "Yes. They were very bad people." "And Jerome Hunter? Is he a bad person?" "He's using his own son as a fighter in illegal tournaments. He threatened to hurt Bradley. So yes, he's a very bad person." Madeline nodded slowly. "Then I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that whatever you do to stop him, you'll come home to us. Bradley needs his father. I need my husband." Alexander lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. "I promise." What he didn't tell her was that Jerome Hunter had already made his choice. By threatening Alexander's family, he'd activated something that couldn't be easily contained. The accountant was coming out of retirement, and Jerome Hunter was about to discover that some debts could only be paid in full. Chapter 4: Old Debts. The Kozlov meeting was set for 10 p.m. at a warehouse on the industrial side of town. Alexander arrived 3 hours early, moving through the shadows with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years navigating dangerous territories. The building was exactly what he'd expected: isolated, multiple exits, and situated in an area where screams wouldn't attract attention. From his position on a neighboring rooftop, Alexander watched as Jerome's black Escalade pulled into the warehouse parking lot. Jerome emerged alone, which surprised Alexander. Either the man was more desperate than expected, or he was stupider. Given Jerome's history, it was probably both. The Kozlovs arrived 15 minutes later in a convoy of 3 black Mercedes sedans. 6 men emerged, all wearing identical dark suits and moving with military precision. Alexander recognized their leader, Dmitry Kozlov, son of the organization's patriarch and a man known for his creative approach to debt collection. Through high-powered binoculars, Alexander watched the meeting unfold. Jerome was gesticulating wildly, clearly trying to negotiate. Dmitri remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. The conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes before Dmitri raised one hand. The gesture was subtle, but two of his men immediately moved to flank Jerome. Whatever Jerome had proposed, it wasn't acceptable. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message. Meeting complete. Subject agreed to Kozlov terms. Payment due in 72 hours. The message came from one of Mr. Smith's assets who'd managed to place a listening device near the warehouse. 72 hours. Jerome had bought himself 3 days, but at what cost? The answer came the next morning when Alexander arrived at his office to find a panicked voicemail from Principal Ross. Mr. Landry, Kyle Hunter didn't come to school today, and neither did 3 other children from the youth fighting program. Their parents are frantic. Please call me immediately. Alexander didn't need to call her back. He already knew what had happened. Jerome had offered the Kozlovs something more valuable than money: young fighters for their own underground tournaments. Children who could be trained, controlled, and exploited far more efficiently than adult fighters. The realization filled Alexander with a cold fury that he hadn't felt in 15 years. Jerome Hunter had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That afternoon, Alexander received a call from Kara Stewart with an update that confirmed his suspicions. Jerome Hunter withdrew his son from Riverside Middle School this morning, along with 3 other kids whose families are connected to his fighting operation. Word on the street is he's relocating to Chicago for expanded business opportunities. What about the other children? Their parents are terrified. They've been told that if they go to the police or try to interfere, their kids will disappear permanently. These families are trapped, Alex. Hunter's using their children as collateral for his own debts. Alexander ended the call and sat in his office chair, staring out at the city skyline. In his previous life, he would have handled this situation with clinical efficiency. Eliminate Jerome, recover the children, and disappear before anyone could connect him to either action. But he wasn't that man anymore. He had a family, a legitimate business, and a life he'd spent 15 years building. But he also had a son who needed to understand that good people didn't walk away when children were in danger. That evening at dinner, Bradley was unusually quiet. When Madeline asked about his day, he just shrugged and picked at his food. Kyle Hunter didn't come to school today, Bradley finally said. Neither did Tommy Martinez or Sarah Chun. Their parents came to pick up their homework, but they wouldn't say why. Alexander and Madeline exchanged glances. They'd agreed not to involve Bradley in the situation with Jerome, but their son was smart enough to notice when something was wrong. Sometimes families have to move suddenly, Madeline said gently, for work or other reasons. But Tommy told me last week that his dad just got a new job at the auto plant. Why would they move now? Bradley looked at his father. Is this because of what happened with Kyle's arm? Because of what I did. The direct question hit Alexander like a physical blow. His son was blaming himself for whatever was happening to the other children. Bradley, look at me. Alexander waited until he had his son's full attention. What you did was right. You protected someone who couldn't protect himself. Whatever is happening now, it's not your fault. But if I hadn't broken Kyle's arm, then Tommy would still be getting beaten up every day, and eventually Kyle would have hurt someone even worse. You did what had to be done. After Bradley went to bed, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He opened his laptop and began typing a message to Mr. Smith. I'm taking the Hunter contract. Full package. Timeline, 48 hours. The response came back within minutes. Understood. Resources are being deployed. Welcome back, accountant. Madeline appeared in the doorway of his study, wrapped in her robe. You're going after him, aren't it? He has 4 children, Maddie. He's going to use them as fighters for people who don't care if they live or die. And you think you can save them? Alexander looked at his wife, seeing the fear and love warring in her eyes. I know I can, but I need you to trust me. And I need you to be ready to disappear if things go wrong. Disappear? I have resources you don't know about. Safe houses, new identities, money that can't be traced. If this goes bad, I can have you and Bradley relocated within 6 hours. Madeline sat down in the chair across from his desk. How long have you been planning for this possibility? Since the day we met. Since the day I realized I had something worth protecting. She was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what he'd told her. Finally, she looked up at him. Those children, Tommy, Sarah, and the others, they have families who love them too. I know. Then bring them home, Alex. All of them. Alexander reached across the desk and took her hand. I will. I promise. What neither of them said was that bringing the children home would require Alexander to become someone he'd sworn he'd never be again. But some promises were worth any price, and some debts could only be paid with blood. The accountant was coming out of retirement, and Jerome Hunter was about to learn that there were some equations that always balanced, no matter how long it took to solve them. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. Jerome Hunter's Chicago operation was housed in an abandoned textile factory on the south side, a maze of industrial corridors and forgotten maintenance tunnels that provided perfect cover for illegal activities. Alexander had been studying the building's blueprints for 6 hours, memorizing every entrance, exit, and blind spot. Mr. Smith's intelligence network had provided a complete picture of Jerome's new arrangement with the Kozlovs. The 4 children, Kyle Hunter, Tommy Martinez, Sarah Chun, and a boy named Israel Powers, were being housed in a converted dormitory on the factory's second floor. They were being trained 16 hours a day, preparing for a tournament that would take place in 3 days. The winner would earn Jerome enough money to pay his debts. The losers would be sold to other organizations for future tournaments. All 4 children would be trapped in the system indefinitely. Alexander's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Infiltrate the facility, neutralize Jerome and his security, and extract the children without alerting the Kozlovs to his involvement. It was the kind of operation he'd executed dozens of times in his previous life. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't working for money or territory. This time, it was personal. At 11 p.m., Alexander parked his rental car 6 blocks from the factory and began his approach on foot. He wore dark clothing and carried a small pack containing specialized equipment that Mr. Smith had provided: lockpicks, electronic surveillance devices, and a Beretta 9mm with a custom suppressor. The factory's security was amateur level: 2 guards at the main entrance, 1 patrolling the perimeter, and basic camera coverage that could be easily avoided. Alexander had infiltrated government facilities with better protection. He entered through a service tunnel that connected to the building's basement, moving through the darkness with practiced silence. The tunnels led to a maintenance room directly below the dormitory where the children were being held. Through the building's ventilation system, Alexander could hear voices: Jerome arguing with someone over the phone, guards playing cards in the security room, and something that made his blood run cold: the sound of children crying. Alexander made his way to the second floor using a freight elevator that had been disabled but could be operated manually. The hallway outside the dormitory was guarded by a single man reading a magazine. Alexander approached from behind and rendered him unconscious with a sleeper hold that left no permanent damage. Inside the dormitory, he found the 4 children sleeping on mattresses arranged military-style in rows. Tommy Martinez, the boy Bradley had defended, was curled in a corner, his face bruised and his arm in a makeshift sling. Sarah Chun, barely 10 years old, was whimpering in her sleep. Israel Powers, 13 and the largest of the group, was awake and stared at Alexander with suspicious eyes. "Who are you?" Israel whispered. "I'm here to take you home," Alexander replied quietly. "All of you? You can't. They'll find us. They always find us." Alexander knelt beside the boy's mattress. "My name is Alex Landry. My son is Bradley. He goes to school with some of you. I'm here to end this." Recognition flickered in Israel's eyes. "You're Bradley's dad? The one who made Mr. Hunter scared?" "Yes. Now I need you to wake the others quietly. We're leaving." As the children stirred awake, Alexander could hear footsteps in the hallway. Someone had found the unconscious guard. He had minutes before the entire facility would be on alert. "There's a fire escape at the end of the hall," Alexander told the children. "I need you to go there and wait for me. Don't come back no matter what you hear." "What about Kyle?" Tommy whispered. "He's not here. Mr. Hunter keeps him in a different room." Alexander felt his jaw clench. Jerome was keeping his own son separate, probably giving him better treatment while the other children suffered. It was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation that Jerome specialized in. "I'll get Kyle. You 3 get to that fire escape now." As the children crept toward the hallway, Alexander heard Jerome's voice echoing from somewhere above. "Find them. They can't have gotten far." Alexander made his way to the 3rd floor, following the sound of Jerome's increasingly agitated commands. He found Kyle Hunter in what had once been an executive office, furnished with a bed, desk, and even a television. The boy was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his broken arm still in a cast. "You," Kyle said when he saw Alexander. "You're Bradley's dad." "Yes. I'm here to take you home. I don't want to go home with you. My dad says you're dangerous." Alexander studied the boy's face. Kyle was clearly afraid, but there was something else, a Stockholm Syndrome-like loyalty to his father despite the obvious abuse. "Kyle, do you know what your father has planned for you? Do you know about the tournament?" The boy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I'm going to win. My dad says I'm the best fighter he's ever trained." "And if you lose? Has he told you what happens then?" Kyle's silence was answer enough. Jerome had filled his son's head with dreams of victory without explaining the consequences of failure. "Your choice, kid. Come with me now, or stay and find out what your father really thinks of you." Before Kyle could answer, the door burst open and Jerome Hunter stepped inside, flanked by two armed men. He was holding a pistol pointed directly at Alexander's chest. Well, the famous accountant, breaking into my place of business." Jerome's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the fear in his eyes. "You always were too sentimental for this line of work. Let the children go, Jerome. Your problem is with me. My problem is that you cost me everything." Jerome's composure cracked, spittle flying as he shouted. "Kyle was going to make me rich. That tournament was going to solve all my problems. By sacrificing 4 children to pay your debts? You've sunk lower than I thought possible." Jerome laughed, a harsh sound. "You think you're better than me? How many children died because of the choices you made? How many families were destroyed by your equations?" The accusation hit home, but Alexander didn't flinch. "You're right. I have blood on my hands. But I never hurt children. That was always the line I wouldn't cross." "Well, I guess that makes you a real saint." Jerome raised his pistol. "Too bad Kyle's going to watch his hero die." What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Alexander dove left, drawing his own weapon while rolling behind Kyle's desk. Jerome's first shot went wide, shattering the window. Alexander's response was precise, a single shot that caught Jerome in the shoulder, spinning him around, and sending his pistol skittering across the floor. The 2 guards raised their weapons, but Alexander was already moving. Years of training and experience took over, muscle memory guiding his actions. He put both men down with controlled bursts that were lethal but clean. When the shooting stopped, Jerome was on the floor, clutching his wounded shoulder. Kyle was pressed against the wall, his face white with shock. "It's over," Alexander said quietly. But Jerome wasn't finished. With his good hand, he reached for a backup pistol hidden in his boot. "If I can't have my son, neither can you." The final shot echoed through the room. Jerome Hunter collapsed and didn't move again. Kyle stared at his father's body, then looked up at Alexander. "Is he dead?" "Yes." The boy was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Good." Chapter 6, Ghosts and Consequences. The extraction took 47 minutes. Alexander led the 4 children through maintenance tunnels and service corridors, avoiding the Kozlov security teams that were already responding to reports of gunfire at the factory. By the time the police arrived, Alexander and the children were 3 miles away in a stolen van, heading toward a safe house that Mr. Smith had provided. The safe house was a modest apartment above a 24-hour diner, unremarkable and easily overlooked. Alexander settled the children in the living room and gave them food from the diner below while he made a series of phone calls. The first call was to Detective Ray Mitchell. "Ray, I need you to meet me at the Riverside Diner on Highway 12. Bring child services and some social workers. I'm returning for missing children." "Alex, what the hell did you do?" "I solved a problem. The children are safe, and Jerome Hunter won't be threatening anyone else." The second call was to Madeline. "It's done," he said simply. "I'm bringing them home. All of them. All of them." The third call was more difficult. He dialed the number for Tommy Martinez's parents and heard Maria Martinez answer on the first ring. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Alexander Landry, Bradley's father. I have Tommy. He's safe." The woman's sobs of relief were audible through the phone. "Where is he? Can I see him?" "Riverside Diner on Highway 12. Bring identification and be prepared to answer questions from the police." Alexander made similar calls to the other families, each conversation ending with the same mixture of relief and disbelief. Within an hour, the diner's parking lot was filled with police cars, social services vehicles, and frantically grateful parents. Detective Mitchell arrived, and took Alexander aside while the children were reunited with their families. The Chicago PD found 4 bodies at that factory, including Jerome Hunter. They're calling it a gang war, but I know better. Mitchell studied Alexander's face. How much of this is going to come back on you? None of it. Jerome Hunter had a lot of enemies, and the Kozlovs had plenty of reasons to eliminate him. The official story will be that rival organizations got into a shooting match over territory. And the children were rescued by an anonymous tip that led police to a secondary location. They'll all say they don't know who helped them escape because they were kept blindfolded during the extraction. Mitchell nodded slowly. You've thought of everything. Just like the old days. Not everything. Alexander looked through the diner window at Tommy Martinez hugging his parents. I didn't think about what comes after. What do you mean? In the old days, I solved problems and walked away. But these children, they're going to need help processing what happened to them. They're going to need therapy, support, time to heal. And their families are going to have questions. Questions you can't answer without revealing who you really are. Exactly. Detective Mitchell was quiet for several minutes, watching the emotional reunions taking place in the diner. Finally, he looked back at Alexander. Maybe it's time to stop running from who you used to be. These kids are alive because the accountant came out of retirement. Their families have their children back because you remembered how to be dangerous when it mattered. And when word gets out about what happened in Chicago, when other people from my past realize I'm still alive, then you deal with them the same way you dealt with Jerome Hunter. Alexander shook his head. I can't live that life anymore, Ray. I have Madeline and Bradley to think about. Then don't live that life. But don't pretend it never happened, either. Those skills you have, that network you can access, maybe there's a way to use them for good. Before Alexander could respond, Kyle Hunter approached them. The boy had been sitting alone in a corner booth, watching the other children reunite with their families. Mr. Landry? What's going to happen to me now? Alexander knelt down to Kyle's eye level. Child Services will find you a good family. People who will take care of you properly. Will I see Bradley again? I want to apologize for what I did to Tommy. I think that can be arranged. Kyle nodded, then looked directly into Alexander's eyes. Thank you for saving us. Even after what I did. Everyone deserves a second chance, Kyle. Even you. The drive home took 2 hours, and Alexander spent most of it thinking about Detective Mitchell's words. By the time he pulled into his driveway on Maple Street, he'd made a decision that would change everything once again. Madeline and Bradley were waiting for him in the living room. Bradley jumped up when he saw his father, relief evident on his young face. Dad, are you okay? Mom told me you went to help Tommy and the other kids. I'm fine, son. And yes, they're all safe. They're back with their families. Even Kyle. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry for bullying Tommy. Bradley considered this. Is he really sorry? Or is he just saying that because he got in trouble? Alexander smiled at his son's insight. I think he's really sorry. People can change when they understand the consequences of their actions. That night, after Bradley was asleep, Alexander sat with Madeline in their bedroom and told her everything about the factory, the children, and Jerome Hunter's final moments. Are you okay? She asked when he finished. I killed 3 men tonight, Maddie. I should feel something about that. But you don't. No. They were evil people who were hurting children. The world is better without them. Madeline took his hands in hers. Does that scare you? That you don't feel guilty? Alexander considered the question carefully. It scares me that it was so easy to become that person again. For 15 years, I've been Alex Landry, businessman, husband, father. Tonight, I was the accountant. And the transition was seamless. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the world needs people who can make the hard choices when children are in danger. What are you saying? I'm saying that Detective Mitchell called while you were gone. He has a proposition for you. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Detective Mitchell's proposition was both simple and revolutionary. Create an unofficial task force to handle cases that fell through the cracks of the traditional justice system. Cases involving missing children, human trafficking, and organized crime operations that were too complex or dangerous for standard police work. Think of it as consulting, Mitchell explained over coffee at a diner across town from where the children had been reunited with their families. You'd have access to police resources and intelligence, but you'd operate with flexibility that we don't have. Alexander stirred his coffee thoughtfully. And when I have to cross lines that cops can't cross? Officially, I don't know anything about your methods. Unofficially, I care about results. Dead bad guys and rescued victims work for me. This isn't just about Jerome Hunter, is it? Mitchell pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table. 3 missing children cases in the past 6 months. All connected to underground fighting circuits. All cases where traditional investigations have hit dead ends. Alexander opened the folder and immediately understood why Mitchell needed his help. The missing children were all from poor families with limited resources. Their disappearances had been investigated, but without the kind of connections and assets that Alexander could access, the trails had gone cold. The families deserve answers, Alexander said. They deserve their children back. That evening, Alexander presented the opportunity to Madeline and Bradley over dinner. He explained it as a chance to use his business skills to help law enforcement with complex financial crimes, a version of the truth that protected his family while giving them the information they needed. You'd be helping find missing children? Bradley asked, his eyes lighting up with admiration. Among other things, yes. That's awesome, Dad. Like a real-life superhero. Madeline smiled at their son's enthusiasm, but Alexander could see the concern in her eyes. Later, after Bradley was in bed, she voiced her worries. This isn't going to be like what you did in Chicago, is it? You're not going to come home covered in blood every night. Most of the work will be intelligence gathering and investigation. But if it comes down to violence, Alexander paused, choosing his words carefully. I'll do whatever is necessary to bring those children home. And if someone recognizes you, if word gets out that the accountant is back, then we disappear. New identities, new life, somewhere far from here. Madeline nodded, accepting the risk because she understood the stakes. Those children in Chicago, seeing them reunite with their families, it reminded me why I fell in love with you. Because I'm a killer? Because you're a man who'll risk everything to protect innocent people. Alexander's first official case came 3 days later. A 12-year-old girl named Alexis Atkins had vanished from a shopping mall in the suburban community of Westfield. The initial investigation suggested a random abduction, but Alexander's review of the case files revealed patterns that the local police had missed. Alexis's disappearance was connected to a network of talent scouts who frequented malls and schools, looking for children with specific physical characteristics. These scouts worked for organizations that supplied young fighters to underground tournaments across the country. Using resources from Mr. Smith's network, Alexander traced the scouts to a front company called Athletic Development Solutions, which claimed to train young athletes for competitive sports. The company's real purpose was acquiring and conditioning children for illegal fighting circuits. The investigation led Alexander to a compound outside the city where Athletic Development Solutions operated a training facility disguised as a boarding school. Satellite imagery showed security measures that were far more extensive than any legitimate school would require. Multiple guard posts, razor wire fencing, and electronic surveillance systems. Alexander spent 2 days conducting reconnaissance, mapping the facility's vulnerabilities and identifying the location where the children were likely being held. What he found disturbed him even more than Jerome Hunter's operation had. The compound housed over 30 children, ranging in age from 8 to 16. They were kept in dormitory-style barracks and subjected to brutal training regimens designed to turn them into fighters. The children who showed promise were groomed for high-stakes tournaments. Those who didn't were sold to other organizations or simply disappeared. Unlike the improvised operation that Jerome Hunter had been running, this was a sophisticated business with connections to international crime syndicates. Taking it down would require more than a single-person infiltration. Alexander called Detective Mitchell with his findings. "We need a full tactical team," Alexander said. "This isn't a warehouse with a handful of guards. This is a fortress. I can't authorize that kind of operation based on your intelligence alone. We need evidence that will hold up in court. Then we need to get someone inside. You volunteering?" Alexander considered the risks. The compound's security was designed to detect and eliminate threats. If he were caught, it wouldn't just mean his own death, it would expose his family to retaliation from the organization. But 30 children were being held prisoner, and Alexis Atkins was somewhere among them. "I'll need 48 hours to prepare," Alexander said. "What kind of preparation?" "The kind that ensures I come home to my family." That night, Alexander opened the locked drawer in his study one more time. But instead of just looking at the artifacts of his former life, he began preparing to use them. The accountant was going back to work, and this time, He wasn't just balancing equations. He was going to war. Chapter 8. Inside the Fortress. Alexander's infiltration plan relied on a fundamental truth about criminal organizations. They were always looking for new talent, and they rarely questioned a profitable opportunity when it was presented correctly. Using forged credentials provided by Mr. Smith's network, Alexander posed as Marcus Webb, a wealthy businessman looking to invest in alternative athletic programs for underprivileged youth. His cover story was simple. He wanted to identify promising young fighters and sponsor them in legitimate competitions. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries, and Alexander found himself sitting across from Dr. Clinton Spence, the man who ran Athletic Development Solutions. Spence was in his 50s, impeccably dressed, and possessed the kind of clinical demeanor that made Alexander's skin crawl. "Mr. Webb, your interest in youth athletics is commendable," Spence said as they toured the facility's public areas. "But I should clarify that our program is quite intensive. Not all parents understand the level of commitment required." "I appreciate programs that demand excellence," Alexander replied. "Too many young people today lack discipline." Spence smiled approvingly. "Precisely. Our students learn that success requires sacrifice, sometimes significant sacrifice." The tour included the facility's training areas, dining hall, and administration building. Everything was clean, well-maintained, and designed to impress potential investors. But Alexander noticed details that confirmed his worst fears: reinforced doors, security cameras positioned to eliminate blind spots, and staff members who moved with the controlled alertness of professional guards. "I'd like to see your students in action," Alexander said. "Perhaps observe a training session?" "Of course. We have a demonstration scheduled for this evening. I think you'll find it quite impressive." The demonstration took place in a gymnasium that had been converted into a fighting arena. Bleachers surrounded a central mat where children as young as 10 years old engaged in full-contact combat, while adults placed bets on the outcomes. Alexander watched in controlled fury as a girl who couldn't have been older than 12 systematically destroyed a boy her own age. The crowd cheered as she broke his nose with a precise elbow strike, then chanted for her to continue the assault even after he'd clearly been defeated. "That's Stephanie Holden," Spence said proudly. "One of our star pupils. She's won 43 consecutive matches." Alexander studied the girl's face as she stood over her defeated opponent. There was no joy in her victory, no satisfaction in her dominance. Her eyes were empty, mechanical. She'd been broken and rebuilt as a weapon. "Impressive," Alexander managed. "How long has she been in your program?" 3 years. Her parents signed her over to us when she was 9. They couldn't handle her aggressive tendencies. Signed her over? Complete custody transfer. It's the only way we can provide the intensive training these children require. Parents are too emotional, too protective. They interfere with the necessary conditioning process. Alexander felt his hands clench into fists and forced himself to relax. "And the children who don't show promise? What happens to them?" Spence's smile faltered slightly. "Not every child is suited for our program. Those who don't meet our standards are transferred to other facilities better equipped to handle their limitations." The euphemism was clear. Children who couldn't fight were disposed of. "I'd like to make a significant investment," Alexander said. "But first, I'd like to see your complete operation, including your newer acquisitions." Spence hesitated. "Mr. Webb, certain aspects of our program are confidential. Trade secrets, you understand." Alexander pulled out a briefcase containing $500,000 in cash, money that Mr. Smith had provided for exactly this purpose. "I understand the value of discretion, but I also understand the value of thorough evaluation before making major investments." The sight of the money changed Spence's demeanor immediately. "Of course, I think we can arrange a more comprehensive tour." 20 minutes later, Alexander was following Spence through a section of the compound that visitors weren't meant to see. They passed dormitories where children slept on metal bunks, medical facilities where injuries were treated without regard for proper care, and isolation cells where problem students were kept in solitary confinement. "This is our intake facility," Spence explained as they entered a building that looked like a prison processing center. "New arrivals are evaluated and assigned to appropriate training tracks." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Among the dozen children being processed, he recognized Alexis Atkins. She was sitting on a bench, still wearing the clothes she'd been abducted in, her face streaked with tears. "The girl on the left," Alexander said carefully. "She looks familiar." "Alexis?" "Yes, she's a recent acquisition. Showed exceptional reflexes during preliminary testing. We expect great things from her." Alexander nodded, filing away every detail of the room's layout and security measures. "When will she begin full training?" "Tomorrow morning. We find it's best to begin conditioning immediately after intake. The longer children have to dwell on their situation, the more difficult the transition becomes. Meaning we break them quickly before they can develop resistance to the program." Alexander had heard enough. He'd seen the scope of the operation, confirmed that Alexis was here, and identified the facility's vulnerabilities. Now he needed to extract himself without arousing suspicion and prepare for the most complex operation of his career. "Dr. Spence, I'm very impressed with what you've built here," Alexander said as they returned to the administration building. "I'd like to move forward with a substantial investment, but I'll need a few days to arrange the financing." "Of course, but I should mention that we have other interested parties. If you're serious about this opportunity, I'd recommend moving quickly." Alexander shook hands with the man, fighting the urge to crush his windpipe. "I'll be in touch within 48 hours. That night, Alexander sat in his hotel room and called Detective Mitchell. "I found her. Alexis Atkins is alive, but we need to move fast. They're planning to start full conditioning tomorrow, and from what I've seen, children don't survive that process intact." "What do you need?" "Everything. Full tactical support, federal assistance if you can get it, and a media blackout until we're done. This operation is going to be messy." "How messy?" Alexander looked out his hotel window toward the compound where 30 children were being held prisoner. "The kind of messy that ends with congressional hearings and international news coverage. But those kids are going home to their families." "And Dr. Spence?" "Dr. Spence has an appointment with the accountant. He's going to learn that some debts can't be negotiated." The final reckoning was coming, and this time, Alexander wasn't just saving 4 children from a desperate criminal. He was dismantling an entire industry built on the suffering of innocence. The war was about to begin. Chapter 9, The Final Equation. The assault on the Athletic Development Solutions compound began at 3:17 a.m. when Alexander disabled the facility's primary generator using explosives he'd planted during his reconnaissance. The compound's backup power systems activated immediately, but the brief interruption gave the tactical teams crucial seconds to breach the perimeter undetected. Alexander moved through the facility like a ghost, using maintenance tunnels and service corridors to avoid the panicked guards who were scrambling to respond to multiple simultaneous breaches. His target was the intake facility where Alexis Atkins and the newest captives were being held. The building was guarded by 2 men armed with automatic weapons. Alexander eliminated both with suppressed shots from 50 yards, then moved to the entrance. The electronic lock had defaulted to secured mode when the power fluctuated, but Alexander's lock picks opened it in 30 seconds. Inside, he found 17 children ranging in age from 8 to 15. They were awake but terrified, huddled together in the processing room where he'd seen them during his tour. "My name is Alex," he said quietly, kneeling down to their eye level. "I'm here to take you home." Alexis Atkins looked up at him with hollow eyes. "Are you real? They said no one would come for us." "I'm real, and I'm here. But I need you all to be very brave for just a little longer." Alexander activated his radio headset. Package 1 secured. 17 packages ready for extraction. Detective Mitchell's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Route Alpha is clear. Move to extraction point." Alexander led the children through the facility's kitchen and out a service door that opened onto the compound's eastern perimeter. A team of federal agents was waiting with vehicles and medical personnel to transport the children to safety. "These are the good guys," Alexander told the children. "They're going to take you somewhere safe while I help the other kids." As the vehicles pulled away, Alexander turned back toward the main compound. Phase 1 was complete, but 30 more children were still trapped in the dormitories and training facilities. The assault on the main compound was more challenging. Dr. Spence had activated the facility's lockdown protocols, sealing the dormitories and barricading himself in the administration building with his senior staff. The tactical teams were engaged in room-to-room fighting with the compound's security force. Alexander bypassed the main battle entirely, using his knowledge of the facility's layout to access the dormitory complex through a forgotten maintenance tunnel that connected to the building's basement. The children were locked in their rooms, but the electronic security system had reverted to manual operation after the power surge. He found Stephanie Holden, the girl who dominated the fighting demonstration, sitting alone in a cell-like room. She looked up when he opened the door, her empty eyes showing a flicker of recognition. "You were watching me fight," she said. "Yes, but that's over now. You're going home." "I don't have a home. Dr. Spence says my parents gave me away because I was bad." Alexander knelt beside her bed. "Dr. Spence lied to you. Your parents have been looking for you for 3 years. They never stopped hoping you'd come home." For the first time, emotion flickered across the girl's face. "They want me back? Even after everything I've done. Especially after everything you've done. You survived, Stephanie. You're stronger than they ever imagined possible." One by one, Alexander opened the dormitory doors and led the children toward the extraction point. Some were catatonic with fear, others were aggressive and suspicious, and a few were so broken by their conditioning that they begged him not to take them away from the only life they remembered. But they all came with him, because deep down, beneath the trauma and conditioning, they were still children who wanted to go home. The battle for the administration building was brief but decisive. Dr. Spence and his staff had barricaded themselves in his office, but they were academics and businessmen, not soldiers. When the tactical team breached their barricade, they surrendered immediately. Alexander found Dr. Spence sitting behind his desk, still wearing his expensive suit, but looking far less composed than during their meeting. "Mr. Webb," Spence said with forced calm, "I assume this raid is connected to your visit yesterday. My name isn't Webb. And yes, this is connected to our conversation." "Who are you?" Alexander removed his tactical mask and looked directly into Spence's eyes. "I'm someone who balances equations. You've been taking children from their families for years, turning them into weapons, destroying their lives for profit. Tonight, we balance that equation." Spence's composure cracked. "You don't understand the work we do here. These children come from broken homes, abusive situations. We gave them purpose, discipline, a chance to be something special. You turn them into slaves and gladiators. I turn them into warriors." Alexander pulled out his sidearm and placed it on the desk between them. "Dr. Spence, you have a choice. You can cooperate with the federal investigation, provide names and locations of everyone connected to this operation, and spend the rest of your life in prison. Or what? Or I solve this equation permanently, right now." Spence stared at the weapon, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're bluffing. You're working with law enforcement. You can't just murder me." "Can't I?" asked Jerome Hunter about my commitment to protecting children. The name hit home. Spence's eyes widened with recognition and fear. "You're him. The accountant. Jesus Christ, you're really him." "I'm really him. So I'll ask again, cooperation or permanent solution?" "I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything." The operation concluded at dawn. 47 children were rescued from the compound. 17 federal agents and local police were treated for minor injuries, and Dr. Clinton Spence was taken into custody along with his entire staff. The intelligence that Spence provided under interrogation led to coordinated raids across 6 states, dismantling a network that had been trafficking children for over a decade. By the end of the week, more than 200 children had been rescued and returned to their families. Alexander watched the final reunion from his car parked across the street from the federal building. Alexis Atkins was running into her parents' arms, her mother crying as she held her daughter for the first time in 3 weeks. Similar scenes were playing out across the country as other families were made whole again. Detective Mitchell approached Alexander's car and tapped on the window. "The feds want to offer you a position," Mitchell said. "Full federal authority, unlimited resources, your own task force. They're calling it the Special Victims Recovery Unit. And if I say no, then you go back to your consulting business and your suburban life and pretend none of this ever happened." Alexander looked back at the reunion scene, then at a photo of Bradley and Madeline that he kept on his dashboard. "What does my family think about it? Why don't you ask them?" Alexander turned to see Madeline and Bradley walking toward his car. Bradley was carrying a newspaper with a headline that read, "Mysterious Hero Saves Dozens of Children." "Dad," Bradley ran to the car as Alexander got out. "You're famous. Well, kind of famous. The paper doesn't have your real name, but I know it's you." Madeline reached them and looked into Alexander's eyes. "How do you feel?" "Like I finally found the right equation," Alexander replied. "For the first time in my life, the math works out perfectly. Then I think we have our answer." 3 months later, Alexander Landry opened the doors of the Special Victims Recovery Unit, housed in a nondescript office building downtown. The brass nameplate on his desk read Director, but his team knew him by a different title, the man who brought children home. His first case file was already waiting. 8 missing children, all connected to an illegal adoption ring operating out of Mexico. The preliminary intelligence suggested it would be complicated, dangerous, and require the kind of resources that only the accountant could access. Alexander opened the file, studied the photographs of 8 young faces, and reached for his secure phone to call Mr. Smith. Some equations, he'd learned, were worth solving no matter what the cost. And some debts could only be paid by bringing children home to the people who loved them. The accountant was back in business, and this time, he was working for the right side of the ledger. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see